We all set? Good morning, everyone, or should I say good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rena Drake, and I'm a director on the UNH Alumni Association Board of Directors. I'm asking you, my fellow Wildcats out there, and I know there's a lot of you today, to participate in our upcoming 603 challenge to help us build a stronger Wildcat community that supports our students' success. A gift in any amount, yes, any amount, $5, $6.03, anything you can give to your UNH area of interest shows your support of your alma mater. It unites our collective belief in UNH and ensures a strong alumni network for our graduating students. Mark April 8th, it's coming up on your calendar. Make a gift in any amount and make it a great day to be a Wildcat. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Bird.
Great. Thanks so much, Rena. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Stephen Bird. I'm the fairly still new director of the Carsey School, and I'm a professor of political science with a focus on public policy and energy in particular. And I direct the Carsey School. And the Carsey School focuses on impact-based public policy for the public good. We have an emphasis on really rigorous analysis that informs or implements policy for societal benefit. We have 4 research centers that focus on social policy, childcare and poverty intervention, demographic change and its impacts on states, economies, and politics, community engagement for implementation and productive communication in policy development, and impact finance with a focus on best practices for community development and housing and energy development in the finance world. We're also super proud of our 4 master's programs. We have 3 online programs in public administration, community development, and global conflict and human security. And our 4th is our in-person master's in public policy. Check out our website at carsey.unh.edu. Today's panel is going to be structured on really trying to think through the big moves of the Trump administration in its first 100 days. Thinking about public reaction and characterizing what successful outcomes might look like and what some of the key debates are in these issues. Our approach is going to be descriptive, analytical, and nonpartisan in nature. And my hope is to have our panelists help to explain the Trump administration's actions, think through the various impacts, and help explain current and future actions from the perspective of different constituencies. And it should be pretty obvious we're not going to be able to touch on every kind of issue here in an hour-long session, but we're going to do our best. I'm going to start with brief introductions, move through a series of 4 or so questions with our panelists, and then I'm going to move on to Q&A with the audience. There is a question and answer feature, not the chat, but the question and answer feature at the bottom of the screen. And please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and I will try to get to as many as I can. Let me quickly introduce our panelists, and if all of you could put your video on, that would be great. Rich Ashew, class of '86, is the Corporate Vice President of Global Trade and Government Affairs for Lam Research. It's a world leader in advanced semiconductor production, where he leads Lam's international governmental activities, including global trade enablement and compliance, legislative and regulatory matters, and public policy. From 2017 to 2020, he served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration, and he focused on U.S. dual-use export controls, national security, non-proliferation, foreign policy, and strategic industrial resource functions. Rich was a senior executive in the defense industry for much of his career and started in the U.S. Senate as a professional staff member working on procurement. Jennifer Frizzell, class of '90 and '93 JD, is an attorney with a diverse background in public policy, issue advocacy, political strategy, and social impact. She's an expert and seasoned advocate in the areas of reproductive rights, abortion access, maternal health, gender equity, and access to healthcare. And she works as a consultant for a range of nonprofit and philanthropic organizations and coalitions advancing healthcare and civil rights in New Hampshire and New England. She was previously the director of policy at the New Hampshire Women's Foundation and has a long history here in New Hampshire in our policy ecosystem. Dr. Ryan Gibson is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology. He's a faculty fellow here at Carsey, and a founder of the Cybersocial or SciSoc lab at the University of New Hampshire. He's a social psychologist whose research explores how being part of a racial or ethnic group shapes perceptions and judgments, and his work in this area has appeared in flagship sociology journals, including Social Psychology Quarterly, Ethnic and Racial Studies, and Social Forces. And finally, Dr. Elena J. Lyon is a professor of political science and international affairs at the University of New Hampshire. Her research interests include United States foreign policy, humanitarian intervention, peacekeeping, and moral authority in world politics. She's an author of several articles and books, including U.S. Politics in the United Nations, and more recently, the United Nations in the 21st Century. And she's a former editor-in-chief of Global Governance and has served as faculty to the award-winning UNH Model UN team that went to the Galapagos last year. Okay, so let's get going. Just a little context here. 100-day marks have been traditionally reviewed as kind of a key time to assess the initial window when a new administration is trying to capitalize on post-election momentum, trying to think about the goodwill that they might have to implement big, significant policy changes. And this sort of habit came out of Franklin D. Roosevelt's productive first 100 days in 1933 in response to the Great Depression. And ever since then, lots of folks have been commenting on 100 days. And this had really established a tradition where presidents are evaluated on their early accomplishments, their agenda setting, and how effectively they transition from being in campaign mode to actually governing. And I'm particularly happy to have both Rich and Ryan join us again. They did this with Carsey in 2021 for the Biden administration. So there's a little moment of comparison here. And it's probably likely that we haven't seen as active a 100-day agenda as we have seen from this administration in recent history. This is derived in part from a much more experienced administration than 8 years ago, a very clear policy agenda derived or associated with the Project 2025 policy agenda. And finally, the Trump administration has already made clear that they are very willingly going to depart from many norms to a greater degree than we've seen in the last century on the part of any presidential administration. So in all of the forthcoming questions as we go through, what I'm hoping in part for the panelists to do is to tell us what, as we think about these different areas, what does success look like for the Trump administration? And I want to start off thinking about tariffs and trade and the economy. Probably the biggest piece in the news over the last week has been the impending tariffs and the potential impact on trade and the economy. And Rich, I'd love you to assess some of the big moves here. What's success going to look like for the Trump administration in this area? Today at 4 p.m., we're going to have Liberation Day. Well, what does that mean? What are some of the big questions that you're thinking about in this area?
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. And your brilliance in scheduling is on display, given that today's probably the most consequential day for tariff policy. So well done there. It's important, I think, because we can draw a comparison with the prior Trump administration to look at what's happening today in that context. And in that context, the president was keen on tariffs then, 2016 to 2020. But tariffs were a means to an end, and the end was very clearly identified and articulated. He wanted a big trade deal with China, and so what trade mechanisms were employed, what tariff mechanisms were employed, were really to achieve that particular goal. This time around, drawing from the campaign trail, tariffs were the goal, as opposed to a means to an end. He campaigned, loudly on how he loves tariffs, and when you look at the fact that right now he's articulating tariffs as a solution to everything from fentanyl to immigration to revenue deficit reduction, so on, one could argue, obviously this remains to be seen, but one could argue that success has already been achieved since the goal was tariff. and we've already had tariffs and will continue to have more, he could declare victory at any moment. That said, there's another important difference, and the difference is in Trump version 1, the tariffs that were employed were fairly traditional. There's things called 301 tariffs, 232, and those all require some sort of study, some sort of investigation before they're employed. This time around, the president's choosing a third way, which is an emergency authorization, which requires no study. So the unintended consequences of the tariff approach this time around are likely to be more significant because the study hasn't been there. Again, it remains to be seen, and it certainly remains to be seen what kind of what tariffs and their extent will be employed. The one thing I'd say about this term liberation, that seems to be a reference to what is now becoming the driving motivation, which is called reciprocity. The president is articulating that the tariffs are going to be employed mainly to level the playing field with other nations. Although, again, whether that is true in substance will remain to be seen.
Great. Thanks so much, Rich. I have a variety of follow-ups, but I wanted to bring this over to Elena and have you think a little bit about how tariffs are affecting the broader international relations with other countries. What is the response when we're thinking about, our relationships with China, Russia, Canada, Europe, the global South, the developing world? How is this playing out, and where do you think it goes going forward?
Thank you, Stephen. And I really appreciate Rich's comment about tariffs as kind of a mechanism. So when I think of tariffs, one, it's a 19th century kind of model that we got to go back to historically to understand the use of tariffs as kind of a foreign policy mechanism. And I'll remind everyone that there was an institution, an agreement here in New Hampshire called the Bretton Woods Agreement, which actually established the rules of the game in terms of international economic interactions between countries, right? So it established the IMF, the World Bank, and then the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, the ITO. So in terms of unfair trade practices, there are mechanisms in place called the World Trade Organization in which countries can go and they have a table in which they can debate, and there's processes, if you're dealing with unfair trade practices. So if we take tariffs as a mechanism to get better trade practices, there's a way to do this without the way the Trump administration is going about it. But this is Donald Trump, and he likes to, he wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, and he likes to use things like this as leverage, right? And, in terms of the question about success, he has used tariffs as a mechanism to get leverage and folks to the bargaining table, right, to negotiating table, and actually did this with Mexico a few weeks ago, and Mexico said, okay, uncle, we'll back off. Now, the challenge is that when you're talking about 25% tariffs or reciprocal tariffs or across the board, I mean, this is a world politics issue, right? So other countries are looking at this like, wait a minute, you're changing the rules to the game. This is the rules that actually were written in New Hampshire and largely by the United States. And so there's a lot of uncertainty and security about that. In addition, there's significant economic impacts for other countries. So for example, on Monday, both Japan and Germany's stock market wobbled significantly. I think it was about 4% loss in both cases. So Japan is very nervous because obviously automobile manufacturing, as is Germany, because this creates enormous unsettlement. In terms of the Europeans, I mean, Germany has done some interesting things lately. Its Bundestag, its parliament just approved a $500 billion spending package for increased military, for increase in they're responding fiscally because of this. In addition, and one of the most notable things I think that's happened in the last 24 hours is China, Japan, and South Korea have said that they will respond in kind, collaboratively, right? So it's going to be, in terms of the tariffs, they're going to have an agreement between those three countries, which is a year ago, I couldn't imagine that China, South Korea, and Japan were going to be kind of united in terms of their response to U.S. foreign policy, economic policy. So it's a really interesting thing. I want to say two other quick things. One, there's a difference between policy and politics, right? So in some ways, when we look back to the last Trump administration, tariffs played really well politically, like in terms of Trump's base. They like tariffs. They like the idea of having kind of a strong man and going and kind of making a fair deal. Policy is a different thing, right? So as that plays out. And then I'll just say one final thing. At the international level, at the global level, it's a hard pill for many countries to swallow when the Trump administration says we haven't gotten a good deal. And that's in part because the US is the strongest economy in the world. The US is the strongest military in the world. Our military spending at $800+ billion is equal that to our 10 nearest competitors combined. So when the United States shows up at the table and says, we haven't gotten a really good deal, there are countries around the world that are going, so it's a tough sell for global partners.
Thanks, Elena. And actually, I'm going to shift this a little bit to Ryan right now because, there's going to be some degree of economic pain that we experience here in the U.S. and how extreme that is still unclear at this point in time and how long it will be. But can you talk a little bit about how that may be playing out amongst different sociodemographic categories in the United States? What do we think the response will be across different parts of the U.S.?
Yeah, sure. That's an excellent question. And thank you so much for inviting me here. It has been it's crazy to think that I was doing something similar 4 years ago with Biden. And I'll say this up front that ironically enough, despite the fact that I think Biden characterized himself much more like an FDR figure, I would go ahead and say that the first 100 days of Trump 2 feel much more akin to what I think happened in the 1930s with FDR's first 100 days in terms of the speed and the sort of pace of change that I think many Americans were grappling with then as now. And I think then what FDR was doing was moving America from a model of high tariffs and economic nationalism into an era of economic liberalization, as Dr. Lyon pointed out, with Bretton Woods in 44, but really actually starting in 1934, right after that first 100-day period, one of the first things FDR did was set up the Reciprocal Tariff Act, which was allowing him to negotiate bilateral tariff agreements with other countries. But then it was to bring all the tariffs down one by one. And this time it's the exact flip. It's giving the president the power and the capacity to build up tariffs to rebuild an economic order that, as Dr. Lyon also said, we really haven't seen since the 19th century. So to your point, I think how that fits into the 2020s is, David Shore, who's an American data scientist, has done some really interesting polling about the 2024 election. And I think there's one question that I think sticks out to a lot of people, which was voters were asked, what's more important, preserving American institutions or delivering change that improves lives? And only 18% of voters said preserving institutions. 78% said that delivering change that improves lives was most important to them. And I think what many voters were feeling was that the prior economic liberal system wasn't working for them, whether it's rents, housing, groceries. And they were thinking, if there's two things that are true about Americans, I think it's that they're pragmatic and they like to experiment. We have 50 states that are experimenting with all kinds of things. I think what the president is doing is really experimenting with a return to economic nationalism in the 21st century and what that looks like. And I think the big question for him will be, can you experiment, even if it's with an old system, can you experiment with this and deliver change that improves people's lives? And I think that's where voters right now, I mean, if you look at the polling, it's not negative or very positive, it's sort of middling. And I think that's because Americans are waiting to see the results of some of these big changes in the experiments. And that includes with tariffs. I mean, to quote President Donald Trump, he said, President McKinley made our country very rich through tariffs and through talent. He was a natural businessman. And that was the time of Carnegie, Rockefeller, Jay Gould. And I think what Trump is saying is a return to tariffs could be a turn to the rise of the American businessman, even if it's not good for American business. And I think for everyday people, especially voters of color, they're going to be watching this experiment very closely to see, okay, sure, there might be temporary pain, but the promise is that our wages will go up, our cost of living will go down if we control supply chains. So I think the first 100 days and a bit beyond, probably the first 6 months, will be Americans willing to give them that space. But I think especially voters of color, who are often marginalized most by these changes, are going to be very skeptical and going to be looking to see if in a year or two's time, they're playing out in cost of living reductions and quality of life improvements that they're expecting.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And I also really appreciated that reminder to us all, right, that here in New Hampshire, that the Bretton Woods Conference really set the stage for an international order that has primarily functioned in a consistent way for decades now. Jennifer, I wanted to shift gears a little bit here. Another component of Trump actions over the last 2.5 months have been really significant cuts to research, to a wide variety of different healthcare institutions, and to education. And your expertise is in health and also in gender areas. I was wondering if you could talk about how these sorts of things are going to impact here in New Hampshire and across the country, and how and in what ways we might expect to sort of see Trump characterize a success in these areas. You are, yeah, muted. There we go.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for having me. I'm certainly appreciative of the chance to be with the UNH community at a time of great uncertainty for our country and for local and state communities that rely on federal resources and federal partnerships. Most of the advocacy and community-based organizations that I have been spending time with in the first 100 days are really in the healthcare, domestic violence, family and economy areas of our state. And they're really experiencing a lot of feelings of being under attack. Some have lost jobs because of the sectors that they work in. And some have that day-to-day fatigue of not knowing what areas of their work might be impacted next. You know, specifically, you referenced in your introduction Project 2025 and the ambitious policy agenda that Trump disassociated himself with during the election, but surrounded himself with leaders and experts and authors when he formed his early administration. And in many of those areas you reference, in which I'm seeing these actions hit the ground right out of the administration, public health, reproductive health, academic research. We know from this playbook how there was an attempt and an expectation that Trump really wanted to use the attacks on public funding in these sectors to advance some of the other themes that are early prominent in his agenda, like responding to all of the investments in COVID and the scientific areas of research, which he feels, you know, were left over from his first administration as far as the differences in the attitude in the administration and those sectors. In addition, we've seen real efforts to apply anti-DEI lens to a lot of the public investments and the public sectors. And so as a result, you know, in the very early days of administration, he used executive orders to begin terminating contracts, ending funding across the National Institute for Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and, you know, what's foreboding on the horizon with the federal budget is big programs like Medicaid and Medicare. And, you know, with the attacks on these programs, even though the executive is just one part of the legislating and allocation of funding, you know, he's really put up a conflict with organizations and individuals who have had long-time funding with the administration and with our state agencies, leading to various lawsuits about the role of authority of the executive as compared to legislative programs that have been enacted. We've certainly seen the impact of these cuts going forward really beginning to impact certain sectors and certain industries disproportionately. And that is really where the gender impact and the approach that the administration has had to apply such a broad scope to the types of programs it's looking to defund or burrow out or put under increased scrutiny. So in that context, women, you know, any references to female, any references to gender have caused programs, you know, to get defunded and be attacked, as well as, and I know we'll speak to this later, more broad attacks on racial impacts, veterans, disabled. You know, these attacks on DEI really were used more broadly to undermine public health infrastructure. And, you know, a lot of our local and state governments rely heavily on these types of federal funds, you know, in the areas of reproductive health and healthcare that impacts LGBTQ plus populations. There are some particular devastating cuts that dismantle long-term programs that support family planning, maternal health, areas we know we have incredible national disparities. We've also seen tremendous cuts to programs that are ancillary to healthcare, like food security and food banks. And so here on the ground, you know, I feel like there is the downshifting impact of these cuts across sectors and kind of a disproportionate impact that we're going to see on our state and local governments and their ability to conduct activities across public health, healthcare delivery, even in broader areas of health and safety, like domestic violence, violence against women. And I know that the areas of funding are particularly impacting areas of higher education, where much of this research has historically conducted, as well as areas in the public sector who have been critically involved in delivering healthcare and developing innovation in these areas. And so I know you as well have seen how some of this is impacting the higher education sector, and would like to hear from that as well.
No, UNH has a quite very strong as an R1 university and has $350 million in research funding, much of that from the federal government. And the university is trying to understand what changes at the National Science Foundation and NIH, doing work on cancer and space exploration and new technologies, a huge variety of areas, will look like under the new administration. It's been a very, very challenging time because the sort of the full range of how these changes are playing out. Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Agriculture, is playing out across the university, has been very, very challenging. And this is something that we're seeing across all of the major universities, research universities in the country. And I think one of the big questions is, you know, how does this kind of research drive innovation and economic development for your average American? And my thinking is that long term, it drives a lot of jobs and a whole host of other areas that are really important. I think the one, you know, other thing that we want to remember is that many of the so-called DEI initiatives really do focus on a wide spectrum of constituencies in need, and in that does include veterans, it includes Indigenous people, it includes rural areas in particular, and the aged, and low-income families, and so I think it's been a very powerful weapon that the Trump administration has used, and the question is, I think that some of the differentiations across different components of constituencies may start to feel these things in ways they didn't quite expect. Not quite sure. I'm going to shift gears right now, back a little bit more to the international stage. And I want to think a little bit quite specifically here about how some of these cuts play out. They've also played out in the international arena. In particular, USAID, which is the primary agency in the United States for developing international aid, has been cut quite literally almost to the bone. And Elena, maybe you could comment on how this is playing out, where these impacts are occurring, and, you know, trying to think through also a whole set of questions about our international reputation and some broader questions about security that I'll probably bring to Rich in just a second. Go ahead, Elena.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you. And I think this really actually builds, it's not quite a segue, it builds at kind of, vulnerable communities outside of the United States as well as vulnerable communities inside of the United States. But let me back up a little bit and just talk about, when the study of world politics, I often tell my students, is really the study of power and influence, right? And influence, power isn't like the amount of stuff you have. Power is the ability to get things done, right? What you want done. And
Yeah.
the United States has been very good at power for 80 years, right? So we are very good at military power. We are very good at economic power. And there's a concept that we often refer to as soft power. If you can get others, and I think about this with my children, right? If you can get others to buy into what you want them to do without having to force, without having to tear down the walls, if you can get them, and we used to talk about, like, for example, Levi's and blue jeans, like that's a huge source of soft power because everybody wants Levi's and blue jeans around the world. And so if the United States can do that without having to, tear down the walls or use aggressive mechanisms, then that's a very good thing. It's cheap power. And so when we think about USAID, and I'll also remind you that just last Friday, the U.S. Institute of Peace was shuttered or pretty close to shuttered. The Voice of America has also been shut down, which is the first time it's not been out there for about 80 years. These were all mechanisms of U.S. soft power, right? Basically helping countries do things, support their folks in need. In terms of those particular cuts, and I want to just be really clear about them. I mean, one of the challenges when we talk about this is that Americans tend to have misinformation about kind of the cost of these types of programs, right? So, for example, Department of Defense budget is about 860 billion, and that's not including Department of Energy, which does research and development. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, right? USAID was about 60 billion. And when you use that aid, it's often tied, meaning the United States doesn't just show up and hand things out. It's usually tied to particular things, incentivizing particular elements. There were about 5,300 programs that were shuttered. And for example, with the Myanmar earthquakes, the United States isn't on the ground there, and that would have been something USAID would be doing. The United States is the only country in the world that has logistical capacity to get potable water, drinkable water, almost anywhere on the planet within 48 hours. We're the only people that do that. And when we do that, it brings significant goodwill. And when we're not doing that, there's an opening there. So USAID, in terms of the foreign policy assistance budget, it's less than 1%. And Americans, when they're polled, they usually think, oh, 25% of the budget goes to foreign aid. And it's just a really minute, less than 1%. And the other thing that I will just think that I just want to remind in terms of soft power, General Mattis, who was under the previous Trump administration, actually said something about this. And he said something about the State Department, and diplomacy and soft power. And he basically says, if you're going to cut diplomacy, I'm going to need a lot more guns, which basically says the United States had kind of force multipliers with USAID folks on the ground. These are ears and eyes in these communities, understanding the local dynamics and being kind of embedded, if you will, and doing good things. So it promotes goodwill. There are implications for this. And it's China, I think, that actually is feeling the largest implications. I mean, the Chinese have been for years thinking we need soft power. How do we get soft power? And they're not very good at it, but they've been moving in a direction of let's have more influence on these types of things. And so, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS Plus calling for a different economic approach, a different global currency, basically saying we don't have to follow the dollar. The Chinese are actually saying, if you're going to shut down Voice of America, and USAID isn't going to be on the ground in all these different locations, it opens up space for the Chinese.
Yeah.
So I actually think in some ways it might be, in my perspective, kind of an unforced error on the part of the United States. But we'll see. I mean, I don't know what kind of cost savings we're going to gain and those particular costs. So that's a challenging one for me, kind of studying power, to see like what is the gain by shutting down these soft power mechanisms.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Elena. That's a really nice set of perception. If we're thinking about this, Rich, a lot of the work that you've done has looked at, technology and large scale geosecurity issues. There's a whole set of different kinds of tensions right now with Russia and China, but also with Canada, Greenland, Panama, and its canal. And can you talk a little bit about how the Trump administration is thinking through its international reputation and broader security tensions?
Sure. Well, again, it's certainly can't speak for them, but I can observe that there's no evidence that they are thinking through it. Again, to go back to the kind of campaign, which I think is worth doing because that's what voters vote from. They vote from what is said and done on campaigns. The prevailing philosophy for the Trump administration is branded as America First, and that's not a new idea. The idea
Right.
that that Elena mentioned, the suspicion of kind of foreign aid and the misinformation around that. A lot of that is, we should pay for, helping, Americans that are hurting first, and international spending should come later. That's not a new idea. But that prevailing attitude isn't really showing up, and you can see this disparity, quite frankly, between the president and the vice president. We got the gift, if you will, of insight via signal of some deliberations within the administration, and what you saw there is, the America First philosophy showing up by very stern speeches J.D. Vance gave in Europe. Secretary of Defense Hegseth, same thing, very kind of stern warnings to Europe, etc. Meanwhile, on the other hand, you have the president himself discussing things like Greenland, Panama, Gaza, things that represent the opposite of the America First philosophy, things that represent, if they were to come to fruition, would represent huge outlays of dollars. Now, the president is, as long as we've known him as a political figure, has always been sort of given a pass on saying things that might be contradictory or controversial or so on. But I think in this case, you really do have to ask yourself, what are we projecting to our international allies? It's right now, there's a quite a contradiction there. And I have to, again, we can chalk that up to maybe the new administration. That's why we're talking about this in 100 days. We'll see if the next 100 days sharpen that up.
Okay. Thanks so much, Rich. I'm gonna switch to one last question, and then I want to switch over to the audience. I've got a variety of questions coming in from folks watching the webinar, so I've got a whole host of stuff. But Ryan, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about some of these broader, I guess, almost culture war issues, immigration, race, gender issues, a whole set of areas here. Trump's been a pretty polarizing figure in this area, with people that seem to strongly support him and those who are really virulently opposed. And we've seen enormously large movements over the last few weeks. How do you sense the broad impacts of these moves, particularly on immigration and DEI? How do Americans think about these issues? How are they going to play out across? Are these sort of first tier issues for many Americans, or lesser? And how, going forward, what will success look like for the Trump administration in this area?
Yeah, I think that it's an excellent suite of questions. I think I think it's hard to say how they prioritize it. I think for one, the president has a large political imagination, and I see what's happening in the first 100 days as part of a very large and interconnected political project. And I think voters don't see it that way necessarily, but I don't think that they're ranking things in the traditional exit poll kind of category. So,
Yeah.
for example, I think, sort of harkening back to my theme, I think voters, and I agree with Rich entirely that the election matters. I think they were dissatisfied with the system, and I think are looking for what I would maybe call, for lack of a better term, a straightforward type of experimentation. And even, like, let's take this to immigration, for example. And I agree with Jennifer. She said this is a time of great uncertainty. And Dr. Lyon also mentioned, I think very importantly, huge changes to our soft power and what is it in our foreign aid. And I think that circles back to this idea that voters want an administration that prioritizes them. And I think in their own way, they're seeking to reap the rewards of their citizenship and perhaps looking for cheaper goods or greater access to resources. And if the byproduct can even incidentally make them safer by removing criminals, then that's the cherry on top. And I think that's why you've seen, despite the rhetoric around immigration, that Americans are not as wholesale against the policies as you might imagine, and that there's actually a, he won. And I think in large part based on overtures about this type of who's prioritizing you. Are we sending money abroad, or are we prioritizing your needs as citizens? And what I would say from a broader standpoint is during that period of time that I referenced that Trump, I think, is trying to return us to, the 1880s to 1920s. I mean, those were times of great uncertainty and precarity. And I think Jennifer was right. This is a time of great uncertainty and precarity. And what happens in times of great uncertainty and precarity is that immigration, or immigrants in particular, are targeted. And I mean, it's worth noting that in the peak of the Gilded Age was when we saw the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the very restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s, particularly the Immigration Restricting Act of 1924. And so I think we have to be on the lookout. If Trump is moving us back to a time of economic nationalism, again, how can he succeed in ushering the country through a time of great uncertainty where we know migration is going to be an important pivot point, and find success? And I think that if he can find a way to demonstrate and show that his immigration policy is providing benefits to citizens, and he can do so in a way that preserves American sense of decency, which is, I also think, something they haven't quite learned from the first term of the administration, which again, then it was family separation. This time it's quick deportation flights. I mean, it can't betray American sense of decency. So if he can find a way to implement wide-ranging change with minimal disruption to communities, then I think that's part of it. And I think connected in a very similar way is DEI. I think the question is, can he provide significant disruption in a way that voters feel that their lives have been improved by this change? I mean, I'm someone who's immersed in the DEI sort of culture, language, conversations. And, I have my own stance. I think, for example, that most organizations and institutions that hire DEI administrators and bring on DEI offices, what they're trying to do is fix, hundreds of years where we weren't looking everywhere for the best people. And that takes resources, that takes time, that takes administrators
Yeah.
to reorient around recruiting from the best, and then also holding institutions accountable. But I know that there are criticisms from these types of this project from both the left and the right. On the left,
Yeah.
it can be seen as, we're not really holding institutions accountable. You go to big corporations, they say, we're not, problematic or racist. Look at our DEI office, so that's a criticism from the left. And on the right, the criticism is, well, this is just extra bloat. It doesn't really add anything. And I think for the administration's side, they've gone a step farther and said, actually, this is a suite of illegal programs. And so if I were looking at this, again, this is just the first 100 days, there's been a lot of change. Where I would look for immigration and DEI over the next 6 months would be at the courts. For example, with DEI, we've seen them already overturn the executive orders in February, then re-implement them in March because the court said, well, let's see if they can bring any cases under this new definition. And same with immigration. We're seeing a lot of the boundaries being tested, who's allowed out, who's allowed back in, and that's going to play out in the courts and with the judges. So if I was interested in racial policy and I was curious to see how this was going to look similar to or different from the last period of economic nationalism, I would pay close attention to the courts.
That's great, Ryan. Thank you. I think a lot of this stuff is going to play out in the courts, for sure. Jennifer, I'm going to give you the last one before I switch over to the Q&A, but there's still a pretty, in these issues as well, we saw in the election, there was still a very, quite from the perspective of political scientists, an enormous gender gap in voting for the Trump administration. And I think a lot of these issues play out quite differently between men and women. And so my question for you is, does the Trump administration going forward, how are they going to react or deal with or address these potential differences in perception amongst men and women across the U.S. ecosystem? Does that play out any differently going forward? I'm happy to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, not have the historical perspective that Ryan does. I do think relating to the Gilded Age, in thinking about a vision of American women in Trump's America right now is perhaps not, an analogy I can't connect to. There seems to be both as Trump as a political figure and Trump in his policy enactments in quite a bombastic way, a desire to advance the narrative that the white masculine story is the center of American history and erasing the contributions of women and minorities, as we've seen through purges in history, purges in the military, potential review at museums like Smithsonian Institution. And we see a real revival of that strong gender power dynamic in who Trump is, his associations, his subordination of women in his cultural and social behaviors. And so, it's hard to see him as anything other than someone who's benefiting from stirring this divide. And in looking at, trends around young men, his influence and his popularity around young men, looking at differences in how Americans are seeing this time in history across gender, the greatest difference is among young women and young men between 18 and 25. And, clearly the cultural influences that Trump associates with, the MMA fighting, the Andrew Tate, the, real known to be misogynist individuals, it creeps down into how individuals are able to read will the policy enactments, like as we started with your reference to 2025, continue to drive these level of gender attacks, or will Trump deliver on some of these things that, where families are really hurting and needing, like lower costs in these areas that are often more important to people than, how they see themselves vis-a-vis the other gender.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. And so I think as we go forward, sort of thinking about how the Trump administration plays through these issues on that gender divide, it sounds like we won't expect a lot of change. I would say. I have quite a few questions from the audience, and I'm going to jump right in on those and then direct to all of you, however you want to jump right in. One of the first ones that I've got here, and Jennifer, you've gone through law school here at UNH. One audience member says, is there anything we can do if his administration decides to just not follow the law or judicial rulings? And I'd love any thoughts on how the public will react if the Trump administration essentially creates more of a constitutional crisis. Some commentators have noted that there's a good chance we will see some challenges to the judicial system. So happy to hear from any of you in terms of how that may play out.
Well, I'll certainly jump in and say both my poli-sci and my law degree from UNH, taught me a lot about a healthy democracy requires three co-equal branches of government serving at times as checks and balances on one another. And I think that what we see right now is, a leader of the executive branch who sees that as a more omnipotent branch. Many believe, the legislative or the congressional branch is not acting in the fullness of their delegated authority, and the judicial branch, increasingly perceived as political in the minds of individuals in this country, but nonetheless supposed to be the last word on the Constitution. And I think pushing to make sure our own congresspeople are serving in that role, or being willing to show up in ways that those who have influence, and I think we've seen, as we have in other administrations, when people are unhappy, more and more citizen protests, more and more community gathering to be able to demonstrate the real pain and the impact of some of these policies and some of these cuts.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. That reads.
Yeah, I could add a little bit onto that as well. Again,
please, Ryan. Yeah.
I wasn't intending to, but I guess history seems pretty relevant. I would also say that if I was looking for time to look back again to the first 100 days of FDR, it's worth noting that a lot of the changes he was pushing through at the time as well were fought by the courts, and even some of the programs like the AAA, like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, they were found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and they had to rework it to go around. And there was, then FDR wanted to add more judges. So again, one of the things I want to impress upon people is that America has been through a lot, and a lot of what feels unprecedented is quite precedented,
Yeah.
actually. And really intense negative relationships between the Supreme Court and the president, and questions about executive authority and boundaries. They're not settled questions, which is, I think, the fun. The fun of America is that we're always finding ways to challenge and experiment. But that's why I said ultimately it's important to watch the courts. But I make no predictions about how it will play out, because I think Trump very much sees his project as something that goes beyond liberal courts and as part of the New Deal order that was ushered in the 1930s and the 1940s, that I think he's trying, or his administration rather, is trying to move away from, as saying this project didn't really work all that well. So, I mean, I don't know. That's why the courts are exciting to watch, but for that reason, I imagine, though, like what FDR did with the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, when it was found unconstitutional, they found other loopholes in the laws and other ways to make it work so that it still complied with the court order in a way. And I think that's what you're going to see the administration do, is if they get pushback. I mean, again, nothing's for certain, but I imagine what they'll first try to do before pushing and breaking the courts is find every possible way to work within
Yeah.
law and make it work.
I think that reads true.
If
I'm
I
going
could just piggyback on that real quick as well, because I think that
Sure.
there's implications for this at the global level. And there is at the global level, we have something called an international order, right? And there's an international rule-based order in which the rules of the game, again, were largely written by the United States and its allies after World War II, right? 1945, the creation of the UN creates these rules. Sovereignty is the foundation of international law. Countries are not supposed to intervene in the domestic politics of other countries. Countries are not supposed to change territorial boundaries through the use of force. And so these are real kind of foundational international legal norms and guidelines. And just to go back to Greenland and that particular question, Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal, those types of things, those are considered out of bounds, right? One of the reasons that and the United States has actually gone to war to enforce those rules. So if you go back to 1991 and the Persian Gulf War, the reason the US committed force was because Iraq had invaded Kuwait and violated Kuwait's sovereignty, right? One of the reasons, and there were 177 votes on this in the UN General Assembly in 2022 that Russia had violated Ukraine's sovereignty. So again, there are these rules, this rule-based order. And so one of the things I'm watching along those particular things are compliance with international legal norms and that rule-based order.
That's a great add-on, Lynn. Thank you. I have another question. Audience member says it's easy to complain about the impact of changes, but we need to consider the bigger picture of our national debt and how to return to a balanced budget. What is the reaction to higher taxes for all Americans, or I'm assuming to help with our national debt and support of cut programs? Would we see support for that? Or are people going to be willing to address the changes needed to provide a balance between America's culture of empathy and erasing and balancing our debt?
If you're looking for volunteers, I'll jump in. You mentioned my career. I started working for a guy named Warren Rudman from New Hampshire, who is, I think, remembered as one of the primary deficit hawk champions in Senate history. And the problem was so much easier then. The scope of the problem was so much easier then, whereas now interest on the debt exceeds the size of any federal program outside of entitlements. You could buy and sell the Department of Defense for what we pay on interest on the debt. So it's clearly in our national interest to have a plan, but it can't be done on discretionary spending alone. And so the reason why there has not been a plan for balancing the budget has been because the pain involved, or I would say rather than pain, the change involved. We would really need to have a serious conversation about how we pay for certain federal programs, and no one seems to be willing to do it. what I am counseling, anybody, who's listening, paying attention to this, and in particular policymakers, is let's not use deficit reduction as a justification for other objectives. What's going on in the federal workforce and those job reductions, there may be, sound reasons to review federal employment, but you're not going to scratch the surface when it comes to balancing the budget. We need to be honest with ourselves about that.
Great. Any other jump-ins on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add in, I think one of the arguments the administration makes is that if you're looking for a period of time in American history where we had balanced budgets or surplus budgets, they'll point to the fact that most of those years were pure tariff years with no national income tax. So I think that's a part of one of the arguments that the administration is going to make. Like, for example, they're going back to that period of economic nationalism was also a time of budget surpluses, and it was just tariffs. Now, as Rich pointed out, the world was an entirely different place. So it's a huge open question as to whether that kind of order would work in the 21st century. And I think that's what we're about to find out.
I'm also trying to sort of think through how, germane to your earlier observation, Ryan, that Americans want to feel like their needs are being met, and that arguably, both parties in certain kinds of ways have really, both mainstream approaches by both parties have failed to do that to some degree. I'm not sure we're going to be able to balance the debt, address people's needs, and do all those things at once. And so likely the Trump administration is going to have to pick and choose. And speaking of which, I've got a question in the chat, in the Q&A, excuse me. If U.S. needs are being prioritized, how do the reduction in force in the various agencies achieve that? In other words, is this going to, ultimately result in a large-scale tax cut that will benefit many of these people who feel like their needs have not been, or is the idea to prime the economy? How do we feel that plays out?
Yeah, I actually believe the president has said that in order to pay for not new tax cuts, but to extend those that are in place, that will be an issue, in the coming months. And again, that's a bill payer, as are the tariffs for tax cuts that he would like to maintain. Again, the federal workforce, there's not a lot of money there. That doesn't pay for a whole lot when you look at the size of the federal workforce. You're not going to find a whole lot of cost savings there. So, my sense is there are other reasons to go with the federal workforce than bill paying.
Great. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? One last question here, and then I'm gonna shift gears and give you all a little lightning round question that I alluded to with you all earlier. I think the earlier discussion of soft power provoked this question: why is Trump's administration so dismissive of soft power? What do they see as an alternative? Do they think it's just unnecessary because we have might in military and financial power? Is that the play?
So
I thought that was a great question because it is a head scratcher. When you take down an agency like USAID, you are leaving the playing field to the Chinese, to the Iranians, who sure they fund rockets to fire at Israel, but they also fund charitable works that gave them a working majority in the parliament in Lebanon. My sense would be the competitive spirit of this administration would be, well, if Iran puts in, $1 billion, we'll put in $2 billion. Why we would retreat from that playing field is a head scratcher to me.
I agree with Rich that it is a real head scratcher. partly just because US has so many tools, right? I always, when I talk to my students, there's this vast toolbox of so many different resources that we have
Yeah.
built over the course of 80 years, right? And we have these different organizations that we can work through. We can work through NATO, we can work through our regional alliances. I mean, there are all these different ways of accomplishing our goals. And so I think the question for me goes back, like, what is our goal? What does America First mean in terms of our role in the world? And for 80 years, I mean, for 80 years, there's been consensus on the part of Republicans and Democrats that the US would play a predominant leadership role at the global level, right? And that our power actually came with responsibilities, but also opportunities, wonderful opportunities to both assist, and I really like Ryan's point about goodwill, but also economic benefits, right? That we can get into these particular markets and that we have, some people call it sticky power, right? That countries are kind of interdependent with us. And so I think the question really goes back to, you know, what is the role of the United States in the world? And I think that there's some natural retractionism about, you know, especially after Iraq and Afghanistan, that the United States has really done a lot, spent a lot of money, and, you know, there's not a lot to show for it. And so therefore, like, let's bring some of this particular home. And so I appreciate the dialogue and the question in the within the United States about like spending of these resources and American lives and such. But at the same time, this is a really interesting, you have to think about that conversation in the global context, right? So we have a lot of global issues that are what we call multilateral, a fancy word for saying you can't work on them alone, right? So whether or not you're talking about climate change or immigration, which is really a bilateral, multilateral issue, it's not really just a country can do this by itself. Cybersecurity, AI, I mean, these are all, we are going through a social revolution at the global level in terms of our things. And so, I mean, the question I have is, does the United States want to be at the table, right? They built the
Yeah.
tables. Does the United States want to be at these tables
Be at the table.
and be part of
Yeah.
these conversations?
Yeah, that's great. Well, we are wrapping up, so I'm gonna give you all my last lightning round question. So quick response on this. And you know, I mentioned earlier, this has been an administration that is fundamentally changing norms concerning how a presidency ought to work. I had an earlier question in the chat on the administration's use of executive orders. And so could each one of you pick a norm change, pick a fundamental big move, big play that the Trump administration is making that you think is going to, you know, become a major factor going forward in the next 6 to 12 months. You know, Jennifer, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Sure. Well, we got to allude to what I wanted to say a little bit earlier. I think some of the key issues that seem critical to Trump and his success, as well as some of the balance of power issues, will be playing out in the federal courts and in the role of the federal courts vis-a-vis Congress and vis-a-vis the executive branch, and whether or not the sentiment that the majority of American people have now that the president should be accountable to the orders of the US Supreme Court, whether we see that undermined or changed or more attacks directed at those members of our judicial branch who are currently serving.
Great. Excellent. Rich, where are you at?
Yeah, so thanks, Stephen. And by the way, it's been great to be here. So the one that I'll choose, and I'm curious whether or not it will endure into future administrations, is what's been done with the federal workforce. The federal workforce has, throughout its history, been known as having a kind of ruggedized security against, you know, major reductions and things like this, and that got overturned almost overnight. And it's being challenged, but not all the challenges are succeeding. So whether or not our idea of the federal workforce is being kind of insulated from significant you know, reductions as we've seen, I'll be curious to see whether or not that endures.
Great. Elena, what about you?
So I think the norm that I think about at the global level that the United States has been committed to for over 80 years is really about democracy, and not necessarily thinking about democracy inside the United States, but the commitment to human rights, the commitment to democratic processes, rule of law, these types of things that the United States has really supported through both, as I said before, Republican and Democratic institutions. To geek out just a second, there's a lot of political science research that says, it's called the democratic peace theory, and that democracies don't go to war with other democracies. I mean, democracies do go to war, but it's a pacifying dynamic, right? So democracy tends to be good for the citizens in a country. They tend to live longer, they have higher quality of life, all these different indicators about how democracies tend to do better for its citizens. And then it's also good for international politics, right? You tend to see a decline in war between two different democracies. And there's, again, that field of research. So the United States has been the leading voice. And again, the voice of America was out there, and the United States was doing that particular work, supporting governments that may be fragile, that have democracies, or, and it served us through the Cold War and then the fall of the Berlin Wall. And, so there's been this kind of north, if you will, our guiding star has been, we are allies with democracies. Now there are a lot of contradictions in this, like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of places in which, but at the same time, it was kind of, this is the way we go about doing business, and this is our priority. If that's gone, that's, if that norm is, both thinking about people in other countries, thinking about democracy is good for our citizens, and then thinking about democracy is good for international politics. Again, that was a norm. And so that is something that I will be keeping my eyes on, about whether or not that continues to play out, that commitment is still there, or that changes things, because I think it will change significant dynamics at the global level.
That's great. Thanks, Elena. And Ryan, you get the last word.
Wow, thanks. I think that for the most part, it's hard to say just one, because I do think that what we're seeing is a realignment to a classical world order that predates, as Dr. Lyon has pointed out, Bretton Woods, and really, that pre-existed the international order, the table that America built in a way. And I think the name of the game is isolationism. I guess the thing I would be on the lookout for is trust. I think trust, in social psychological terms, it's the willingness to be harmed by someone like you. And I think what the United States has done is shifted trust amongst itself, allied nations, its population, and its gambling. Whether it's changes to civil service with Doge and reducing what the institutions are doing, whether it's tariff policy with our neighbors, trust is a lot easier to break than it is to build. So what does it look like in an environment where you are doing a lot of change that introduces a lot of harm? Now, one of the questions I saw in the chat was related to books I would recommend. And if I were to recommend one book, it would be To Make Men Free by Heather Cox Richardson. It's a history of the Republican Party in the United States. She's at Boston College now, but she went to Phillips Exeter and went to Harvard. So she's kind of local in a way. But that book, I think, really will help us understand what this new world order will look like, and how our place in it is to be functioning. How do we deal with civil service reform, tariffs, patronage, intense immigration and racial issues, selective international engagement with foreign countries? Those were all parts of the environment before, and I think sort of understanding that is going to be critical going forward.
Phenomenal. That's a really, really nice recommendation. Thank you. We've heard a lot about reciprocity and America First. We've heard a lot about potentially moving back to a model of the 19th century. And I think, for me, one thing that really stood out is the question of whether the Trump's moves in all of these areas, defying norms, are going to ultimately be able to satisfy American citizens in feeling like this administration cares about them, and whether those policies will play out in that way. I think there's a lot that's really unclear here. Trump, current polling still suggests he maintains a fairly large amount of support, although that, like all presidents, has dissipated since the election. And a lot of open questions here. But I thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the alum and to members of the UNH community out there who've joined us today, and for the really great questions. we look forward to doing this sort of thing again in the future, and I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks.